Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Brittany of BrittanyJJones.com. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome. I'm a sewing content creator and pattern designer for Know Me Patterns. In today's video, we're going to be sewing along with my latest fall Know Me pattern, and that number is ME2133. This is a girls and misses denim dress. Here's a dress here that I made during the sew along. It has a lot of top stitching on it. You can use a contrasting thread for that if you like. This fabric that I use for the sew along is a chambray. The ones that are on the cover, I used a denim. You will need some heavy duty snaps, and I will link the ones that I use as well as the tool that I use to apply these onto the dress. So go ahead and cut out all of your pattern pieces, transfer your markings, and we can get started sewing. To begin, the first thing that we're going to do is some stay stitching along the neckline edge. I'm going to do my stay stitching at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then while we're at the machine, we can go ahead and create the pleat that's on the lower edge here of the front. To do that, you should have transferred either some lines or some notches. I made some little clips into my fabric. We're going to take the solid line and we're going to fold it over to the broken line. So again, I'm just going to fold right here along the solid line, and I'm going to bring it over to the broken line. Going to grab a pin and pin that in place. So now I'm going to go to the machine. I'm going to do my 1/2 inch stay stitch right here, making sure that I start up here at the shoulder seam and then do my 1/2 inch stay stitch. And then I'm going to baste the pleat in place down here at the bottom. Let's do that now. All right, now that we have basted our pleat along the lower edge and we also have our stay stitching along the neckline, we can go ahead and put this to the side and start to work on the pocket. For our pocket, you should have cut out 2 for the front, and you also should have cut out 2 back pockets. So if you want, you can go ahead and do your back pockets now as well. That way they're already done and out of the way. The process for creating the pockets is the same for the front pockets as well as the 2 pockets for the back. The first thing that you want to do is fold under 1/4 inch on the upper edge of the pocket. You can either fold it under and press it like so, or you can serge the raw edge, which is what I prefer to do. So if you don't want to serge it, again, just fold under and press 1/4 inch on the top edge of the pocket like so, or you can go ahead and serge it. I'm going to serge mine and we'll come back for the next step. All right, now that I have the top edge of it serged, again, yours may be pressed 1/4 inch. Now we can go ahead and fold it over right along the fold line. And now we can go to the sewing machine and we can stitch right along the seam line, which is 5/8 inch. I'm going to start stitching at the top. I'm going to stitch down the side, the lower edges, and back up here along the side. Again, all at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do the stitch now, following along the sides and lower edge of the pocket. Now that we have it sewn, it should look similar to this. We're going to go ahead and trim away all of this facing portion here and then trim a little bit of the fabric to reduce the bulk. So trim all of this facing here like so, and then we can trim some of the fabric here near the corner to eliminate the bulk like so. All right, once you have it trimmed, we can go ahead and flip it right side out. If you have a point turner, you can go ahead and grab that now. Just going to use a little pin here just to poke out that corner. All right, after you have it turned out, now we can go ahead and press it. So you want to press the entire pocket. Once you get over here to the corners, you can fold up the corner like this first, and then fold in the other edges right along that 5/8 inch seam line that we pressed earlier. That way you get a nice clean fold and press at your corners. So let's go ahead and press our pocket in place now. After pressing, this is what my pocket looks like here. And so now we can go to the sewing machine and we want to do a top stitch right here, catching in the facing along the inside. We want to catch in this lower edge, but we're going to be stitching so that we have a nice top stitch going across. If you're using a contrasting thread, this would be the perfect time to pop that in so that you get that contrasting stitch going right here across the pocket. So let's go ahead and do that stitch now. All right, now that we have our pocket prepped, again, you can do this for all of the pockets. You should have 2 for the front and 2 for the back. You can go ahead and stitch them all up now. Let's go ahead now and sew this on to the front. On the front, you should have transferred 4 dots. The 2 at the top, the small dots, that's for the flap, and the 2 large dots that are at the bottom, that is for the pocket. So we're going to take our pocket here, match it up. You want the edges right there. Again, for the large dots, do not have it on the small dots for the flap. And I'm just going to pan around the pocket. All right, now that you have it panned, we can go ahead and stitch. I'm going to begin stitching up here. First, we're going to do an edge stitch, stitching really close to the edge of the pocket. And then I'm going to stitch across about 3 stitches. And then I'm going to do a 1/4 of an inch top stitch, coming right back down along the pocket, and then we can secure the stitch up here at the top. I am going to put some chalk on mine. I like to do this just to give me a guide at my points on where I need to pivot. This just helps me to see my pivoting points. You don't have to do this if you don't need it, but this is something that definitely helps me pivot at all the corners. So now let's go ahead and do our edge stitch and top stitch now. All right, once you have it sewn, this is what it should look like here. Once you have yours sewn, this is what it should look like here. And again, I did the edge stitch all the way around. I stitched across 3 stitches here, and then I pivoted and came back down to do my top stitch at a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, all the way along the pocket. So I have the edge stitch as well as the top stitch, and then you just secure it right up here where you started. That gives you a nice secure pocket because you've reinforced it up here along the corners. So let's go ahead and start working on the flap. To begin working on the flap, you should have cut 4 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. I have this one back here already interfaced, and so with right sides together, like so, right sides together, I'm going to go ahead and pin along the sides and lower edge. Once you have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, again along the sides and the lower edge of the pocket. Let's do that now. Once you have your flap sewn, let's go ahead and trim our seams. Now let's flip it right sides out and go ahead and give it a really good press. All right, now that you have it pressed, it should look similar to this. As you can see, I do have a basting stitch right here, keeping these raw edges together. I did the basting stitch at a 5/8 of an inch. Next, you want to go ahead and do a 1/4 of an inch top stitch all the way along the edge of the flap. Again, we're going to be doing a 1/4 of an inch top stitch. So let's do that now. Now that you have the top stitching along the flap, let's go ahead and grab our front pattern piece. And matching up with the small dots here that are above the pocket, we're going to place the flap away from the pocket like so. And you want to make sure that you're matching up those circles that are here on the flap with the dots that are on the pattern. I'm just going to match up my 5/8 of an inch stitch because that is where those dots are. Just want to go ahead and pin it in place. And so now we can go to the sewing machine. You just want to stitch right across, following along with this basting stitch. Now that you have the flap stitched on, we can go ahead and trim down our seam. You want to be really careful not to cut your garment. Okay, and so now we can flip the flap down like so. Go ahead and give that a good press. And then we can do a 1/4 inch top stitch right along the top of the flap. All right, now that we have it pressed, let's go ahead and do our top stitch right here along the upper edge at a 1/4 inch. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now that the top stitching is done along the top edge of the pocket, let's go ahead and grab the front band. For the front band, you should have cut 4 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. Taking the front band, I'm going to start with one that is interfaced, and with the right sides facing, you want to match up those double notches there and pin that in place. Now that we have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that it's sewn, let's go ahead and trim our seam. And now we can go to the sewing machine and press our seam going toward the band. All right, now that we have it pressed, it should look like this. Next, you want to take the front band facing, the one that is not interfaced, and on the notched edge, you want to press under a 1/2 inch like I've done here. So I've just pressed under a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the notched edge. Once you have that pressed, we can trim this down by a 1/4 inch. You can get a seam gauge out to measure precisely. I'm just going to eyeball mine. And so now with right sides facing, I'm going to place the front band facing over the front band here, the one that is interfaced. And we're going to go ahead and pin and stitch along this long edge. Now that we have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have the facing sewn, let's go ahead and trim. Next, we can go ahead and understitch the facing. So this seam right here, you want to make sure that you have it going toward the facing, and we are going to stitch really close to this seam here, catching in the facing and this seam allowance. Let's go ahead and stitch really close to this seam. All right, now that we have the understitching done, you want to go ahead and give that a press. Press your facing toward the inside like so. And again, there's that understitch that we just did. When you press, this folded edge here that we pressed up under on the facing should go right past our seam. Let's go ahead and pin, and we're going to put pins along the outside right here in this seam here. So I'm just going to put pins right here, making sure that I catch in this edge along the inside. So let's just continue pinning. I'm pinning along the outside, making sure that I catch in the folded edge on the inside. All right, now that you have it pinned, it should look similar to this. We have pinned along the outside, making sure that we catch in the pressed edge on the inside. And so now we're going to go to the sewing machine and do a stitch in the ditch. We're going to be stitching right here in this seam. And again, when we stitch there, we're going to catch in the pressed edge here along the inside. So let's go ahead and stitch right here in this seam now. All right, now that we have the stitch in the ditch, yours should look similar to this. If I was using the same color thread as my fabric, you really wouldn't be able to tell, but since mine is a little bit lighter, you can see it. But go ahead and do your stitch in the ditch. Once you have that done, you can baste along the top and lower edge of your front band just to keep those layers together. And now we want to go ahead and do a top stitch. We're going to top stitch along this finished edge here, this outer edge, as well as this edge. So 2 rows of top stitching, both at 1/4 of an inch. Let's go ahead and stitch that now. All right, I have both rows of my top stitching done. I will say this one here is a little bit harder because you can't really see your needle plates to keep everything lined up, but just do your best, and you can always just transfer 1/4 of an inch with some chalk or a marking tool. That way you have a guide to follow. That way both of them are even. You want to go ahead and do those same exact steps to the other front, and then we can go ahead and start to work on the back. Okay, for our back pattern piece, the first thing that we want to do is create that little pleat along the back the same way that we did for the front. So with this one here, we're going to fold along the solid line and bring it over to the broken line. So just fold right along that solid line and bring it over to the broken line. You may have transferred your lines or some notches like I did, but just make sure that you are folding in the proper direction. Again, take the solid line and fold it over to the broken line. Let's go ahead and baste them in place now. Now that we have both of the pleats along the lower edge of the back basted, now we can put this to the side and go ahead and grab the yoke. For the yoke, you should have cut out 2, and the first thing that you want to do is go ahead and do some stay stitching along the neckline for both of them. I stay stitched mine at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and with the stay stitching, you want to make sure that you're starting at the shoulders and then meeting in the center. Do not just go from shoulder to shoulder. Start at one, come to the center, start at the other, and go to the center to do that stay stitching. Once you have that stay stitching done, let's go ahead and grab our back. And we are going to sandwich our yoke pattern pieces between the back. So I'm going to start with 1. You want to go ahead with right sides facing, match up your notches and pin in place. For the yoke facing, we're going to pin the right side of the yoke facing to the wrong side of the back, like so, and pin that in place, matching up the notches. So again, the wrong side of the back goes to the right side of the yoke facing. All right, once you have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have it sewn, let's go ahead and trim our seam. And so now we can go to the sewing machine, and we just want to press our yoke up. Keep your yoke facing down, and again, just press the yoke up right here along the seam. Go ahead and press that up. All right, now that we have it pressed, again, the yoke facing is still facing down on the inside. Now we're going to grab our fronts, and with right sides together, we are going to pin along our shoulders, matching up our notches. You are only pinning the yoke in the shoulder. That yoke facing is still down out of the way. Grab your pins and let's pin in place. All right, now that we have the shoulder seams pinned here with just the yoke in the front, now we're going to do the burrito method, and I'm going to roll up my front and my back. So I'm just going to start rolling it up like so. And now we have our front facing right here. I'm going to grab the shoulder seams of this yoke facing and bring it over so that it matches up with our shoulder seam and pin that in place. This right here is going to give us a nice clean seam where we do not have to do any Now that we have this all pinned, let's head to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch through all layers using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And you want to be sure that you keep your fronts and back out of the way. You don't want to accidentally stitch anything. So just make sure that you keep everything nice and smooth. And we're going to stitch again at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have it sewn, let's go ahead and trim our seams. Once it's trimmed, we can pull out the front and the back very carefully. You don't want to pull too hard, but just take your time and just kind of bring everything out through the side. All right, once you have it all pulled out, yours should look like this. So this is the yoke here, And this is the yoke facing. You should have a really nice clean seam up here along your shoulder. So let's go ahead and give everything a press. All right, now that we have it all pressed, now we can go ahead and baste the neckline here together to hold these layers here together, as well as the armhole here along the yoke. We can put a basting stitch here. And you want to go ahead and do top stitching along your yoke. So 1/4 inch right here, do your top stitching. 1/4 inch along the shoulder seams, do your top stitching as well. So let's go ahead and do all those stitches now. Once you have your top stitching done and you've also done your basting stitches, let's go ahead and put these right sides facing. So bring your fronts over to your back like so, and we can go ahead and stitch our side seams together, match up those notches, pin in place. Pin the other side the same exact way, and then we can stitch in a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and you can finish off your seam with your serger if you like. After you have your side seams sewn, you can see here I finished mine off with my serger and I gave them a press going toward the back. Now we can go ahead and put this to the side and start to work on the collar. To get started on the collar, you should have cut 2 out of fabric and 1 out of interfacing. We're going to start working on the one that we have applied interfacing to. First thing that you want to do is up to that stay stitching line, we're going to add some clips. And this is just going to help give us some room so that we can spread. I'm just clipping up to the stay stitching line. I'm not clipping past that. And so with right sides together, I'm going to pin the single notched edge of the collar band to the neck edge. So you should have some double notches on this edge and single notches on this edge. We're going to take the single notched edge and we're going to start pinning that in place. I'm going to grab my pins. First, I'm going to match up my notch here and pin that in place. The small dots here, they match up to the shoulder seam. So let's pin there. And just continue pinning the collar on. I'm going to match up my dots and those notches and just continue pinning again. Now the collar band, it will extend past the front opening by 5/8 inch. That is normal. So if you have a little bit of extra, don't worry, it's supposed to extend. Once you have it all pinned, now we can go ahead and stitch using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, after you have your collar band sewn on, yours should look similar to this. This is the outside here. You definitely want to go around the seam and make sure you don't have any folds or any ripples or pulls or anything. You want it to be really nice and clean. And so now we could put this to the side and grab the collar. For the collar, you should have cut out 2 and interfaced 1. I have 1 interfaced and 1 that's not. So with right sides facing, we are going to pin around the sides and the lower edge of the collar. Okay, once you have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch in a 5/8 inch seam allowance along the side. This lower edge here and this side, we're going to leave this notched edge open. Once you have it sewn, let's go ahead and trim down our seam allowance. Now we're going to do understitching along the facing, the one that is not interfaced. To do that, you want to make sure that you have the seam allowance going toward the facing, and we're just going to stitch really close to this seam here, and you can also do it along the sides if you like, do some understitching here as well. You won't be able to get really close up in there because of the corner, but just go as far as you can go. Again, make sure that your seam allowance is facing toward the facing, and let's go ahead and stitch really close to this seam now during our understitch. Now that you have it understitched, let's go ahead and flip it right side out. You can grab your point turner to poke out your corners here, and then go ahead and give it a really good press. After you have given your collar a press, now we can go ahead and do a 1/4 inch edge stitch all the way along the sides, the lower edge, and the other side of the collar. Again, we're going to do a 1/4 inch top stitch. Let's do that now. Now that you have the top stitching done, let's go ahead and put this over the collar band that's already on the neckline. We're going to match up our notches here and pin in place. Now that you have the collar pinned on, let's go ahead and baste this in place. Now that we have the collar basted on, we can put this to the side and start to work on the collar band facing. On the single notched edge here, we're going to press up a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then we can trim it down to a 1/4 inch. First, let's go ahead and press it up again to 1/2 inch seam allowance on the single notched edge, and then we can trim it down to a 1/4 inch. Let's press that now. Okay, I have it pressed up. Now I'm going to go ahead and trim down the seam allowance to a 1/4 inch. Again, you can grab your seam gauge for a more accurate trim. I'm just eyeballing mine here. All right, now that you have it trimmed, let's go ahead and put this over the collar, right sides facing, match up those notches and those circles, and pin in place. Now that you have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way along the collar band. Now that we have the collar band sewn on, let's go ahead and trim our seam. Around the curve here, you do want to notch out some of that fullness, so just make some triangles here. Again, just right along those curves to notch out the fullness here. Okay, now we can go ahead and flip the collar band facing to the inside like so. Now we can go ahead and press the facing down, and just like we did for the front band, you want to bring that pressed edge of the facing right past our seam, and then along the right side we're going to place our pins out here to do a stitch in the ditch. So again, you want to bring that pressed edge of the facing down to the inside. If you like, you can go ahead and press it, that way it's down. Bring it right past that seam and pin it in place, making sure that you catch in the pressed edge of the facing along the inside so that we can do a stitch in the ditch. Now that we have the collar facing pinned along the outside, again, we made sure that we caught in the pressed edge of the facing along the inside. Now we can go ahead and do a stitch in the ditch right here, sewing right into this groove, making sure that we catch in this pressed edge. Let's do that now. All right, now that we have our stitch done, this is what mine look like along the inside here. I did miss a little bit here, so I had to go back over it, but I ended up catching it the second time. This is what it looks along the outside. We did that stitch in the ditch there. So now you can go ahead and give everything a press, and now we can move on to start working on the sleeves. Start working on the sleeve. You want to make sure that you transfer all of your markings. Down here along the bottom, you should have transferred the stitching line here. Kind of looks like a triangle. We're going to head to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch right along those solid lines. Once you get up near the dot, you will have to pivot one stitch over and then pivot again and come straight down. So again, you're going to be stitching straight up, pivot, and then one stitch, pivot, and then come back down. Let's go ahead and stitch along the stitching line now. So once you have that stitched, and again, you should have one small stitch going across right at the dot. Now we can go ahead and slash up the center all the way till you get to the dot, being sure not to go through that stitching. I'm getting close. I'm going to use my scissors now and just snip the rest of the way. Like so. Now that we have that, now we can put that to the side and start to work on the continuous lap here. On the side that does not have the dots, you should have transferred 3 dots on one side. On the unmarked edge, we're going to fold up 1/4 inch and press that in place. So let's go ahead and press that now. Again, 1/4 inch on the unmarked edge. Now that we have it pressed, next we're going to take the right side of our continuous lap and we're going to put it to the wrong side of the sleeve. And so we're going to match up the circles here. You should have transferred dots from your sleeve. We're going to match those up. Match up your dots here in the center, and it shouldn't be lined up with the raw edge. It should be a little bit off, which is what it's supposed to. But again, match up your dot here at the center with the dot here on your continuous lap. Match that up. Same thing over here. Now, as you can see, it's not lined up with the raw edge. Once you get down here, we're still going to follow the previous stitching line. So just continue adding a few more pins. And now we can go ahead and stitch along the stitching line. Let's do that now. Once you have it stitched, it should look similar to this. And so now we are going to bring that folded pressed edge over. We can go ahead and press that out and then bring that pressed edge right over the seam like so. And then we can stitch the pressed edge over the seam. So again, first, if you want, you can go ahead and just press the continuous lap out. And then again, take that pressed edge and bring it right over the seam. And then we're going to stitch right here along this pressed edge. All right, now that we have it all pressed edge is right over the seam. Let's go ahead and stitch really close to the pressed edge now. All right, now that we have the continuous lap stitch, this is what mine look like here. The front portion here of the lap, we're going to turn that to the inside, just right there. So it was out. We're just going to turn this to the inside and then we can baste this one. And then also we need to sew diagonally right across the lap, and that's just going to secure that. So let's do the stitch now. Again, diagonally right here across the lap. We're going to do a diagonal stitch, and then we can baste the front portion of the lap toward the inside. So just fold it under and baste that in place. All right, now that we have basted the lower edge of the front lap to the inside, and I also have my diagonal stitch here, I'm just going to clip away my loose threads. Now we can go ahead and make the pleat that's on the outside of the sleeve. So we're going to fold along the solid line and bring it over to the broken line. Take the solid line, bring it to the broken line, pin that in place. And now we can go to the machine and baste that in place right here at the bottom for the pleat. Now that we have the pleat basted, let's go ahead and fold our sleeves right sides facing like so. Match up our notches and then we can stitch our sleeve seam. Let's go ahead and stitch using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to finish off my seam with my serger. Once we have the sleeve sewn, you can see here I finished mine off with my serger. I'm going to go ahead and flip it right side out. Next, let's start to work on the cuff. For the cuff, you should have cut out 2 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. On the long edge that is unnotched, you should have a notch on one edge. So on the unnotched edge, you want to go ahead and press under a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, now that we have pressed up a 1/2 inch, we can go ahead and trim this down to 1/4 inch. And now with the right sides facing, I'm going to match up my notch and start to pin this in place, also matching up my circles. Make sure that you have it right sides facing. You will have some that it extends off, that's normal. All right, once you have it pinned, it should look like this. And again, you will have some extending. Let's go ahead and stitch using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, once you have yours stitched, this is how mine's look here. I'm going to go ahead and trim down my seam. We can go ahead and press the seam toward the cuff. So just go ahead and press your seam going up like so, and then we can move on to the next step. Now that we have the seam pressed up toward the cuff, now we're going to fold the cuff onto itself. So you just want to fold it over like so, right onto itself, right along the fold line. And I'm going to place some pins right here along the ends. All right, now that you have it pinned, we can go ahead and stitch the ends in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and stitch the ends closed right now. Now that we have the ends stitched, let's go ahead and trim our seam. Next, we can go ahead and flip the cuff right sides out, grab that point turner and poke out those corners. All right, once you have the corners poked out, let's go ahead and give the cuff a press. Now that we have the cuff pressed and we have that pressed edge right over the seam, now we are going to put pins along the outside, making sure that we catch in the pressed edge along the inside. Again, pins on the outside, right into that seam, catching in the pressed edge on the inside. Let's go ahead and do that for the cuff. All right, now that we have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch in the ditch, making sure that we catch in this pressed edge. Let's do that now. Okay, I have mine stitched in the ditch. This is what it looks like along the inside here. And so now we can go ahead and do our 1/4 of an inch top stitch all the way along the cuff here. So from the seam to the finished edges and the sides, we're going to do a 1/4 of an inch top stitch all the way around the cuff. All right, now that we have our top stitch done along the cuff, you want to make sure that you go ahead and do those same steps to your other sleeve. And now let's go ahead and install them into the bodice. One thing that I do have on my sleeve up here between the notches, so from notch to notch, I do have 2 rows of ease stitches here. I've just lengthened out my machine stitch to the longest stitch length, so this is a 5.0 instead of the standard 2.5 stitch length. And I just did 2 rows right here within the seam allowance, so that way I'll be able to pull on these stitches to ease in any fullness as we pin it to the bodice. So with right sides facing, I'm going to find my notches. So this is a double notch, this is a single notch. The single notch goes toward the front, the double notch goes toward the back. And so right sides facing, I'm going to pin at my shoulder seam and side seam first and match those up like so. And then I'm going to pull this to the inside. I'm going to pull up on those ease stitches to ease in some of this fullness. I can go ahead and start pinning this in place. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pin the other sleeve in the same exact way. Once you have your sleeves pinned, let's go ahead and stitch using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then you can stitch again within the seam allowance 1/8 of an inch away from the first stitch, or you can just clean it up with your serger. I'm going to stitch mine at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then just use my serger to finish off the seam. Let's stitch them now. All right, once you have your sleeves sewn, your seam should look like this. As you can see, I did go around with my serger. Also, make sure that you don't have any folds or pulls or ripples or anything. You want to have a nice clean sleeve here. Go ahead and do that, and then we can move on to the next step. Next, we're going to start working on our skirt. So starting with the right skirt front, pattern piece number 12, I'm going to go ahead and grab the pocket facing, which is pattern piece number 16. And I'm going to place these right sides facing like so, right up here at the top. Having the raw edges even, I am going to pin and stitch this upper curved edge. So first I'm going to go ahead and pin. You can match up your notch. Now let's go ahead and stitch using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have it sewn, we can go ahead and trim our seam. And I'm also going to place some clips here right into this curve. I clipped right up to the stitching line. I did not go past it. Now I'm going to go ahead and do some understitching. And so with the seam allowance facing toward the pocket facing, make sure the seam allowance is facing toward the pocket facing. Now we can go ahead and stitch really close to the seam, catching only the pocket facing and the seam allowance. Do not stitch on the right side of the skirt. Again, this is an understitch, so it's going to be right here on the pocket facing and the seam allowance only. So let's go ahead and do this understitch now. Now that we have the understitching done, now let's go ahead and do the top stitch. And again, the top stitch is 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. Let's go ahead and do a top stitch now all the way along the curved edge here. Now that we have the top stitching done, we can go ahead and set this to the side for just a moment. And then we can go ahead and grab pattern piece number 18. This is the pocket. You should have cut one. As you can see here, I've gone ahead and done my 5/8 of an inch stitch around the edges. That's just going to be a guide to help me fold everything in nice and neat. That is optional. You can always just use your seam gauge to make sure that you fold everything in. But as you can see, I went around the edges here, along the sides and the lower edge to stitch right along the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now for the top of the pocket here, we're going to create a narrow hem. So I'm going to fold under 5/8 of an inch, fold in the raw edge, and then we're going to stitch close to the pressed edge. I'm going to go ahead and press it first. Okay, with it pressed, this is what that looks like. And again, I just pressed under 5/8 of an inch, and then I folded the raw edge into that crease and pressed it over. So this is what that narrow hem looks like. Now we can go ahead and stitch really close to this inner fold. All right, now that we have it stitched, now I'm just going to go ahead and fold in right along the stitching line that I created and fold all the edges along the pocket. Once you get to the corner, again, just like we did for the other pockets, you can create that triangle in the corner and then press up the sides so that you get a really nice clean corner here on your pocket. So let's go ahead and press up the sides and the lower edge of the pocket now. Once you have your pocket folded in, it should look similar to this. This is what mine looks like on the inside. And so now let's go ahead and pin this to the pocket and the side front. That is pattern piece number 17. You should have transferred some dots. The 2 dots right up here for the right side only, that's where we're going to put the top of our pocket. And we can pin all the way around the pocket now. All right, once you have it pinned on, it should look similar to this. Now we can go ahead and stitch. We're going to stitch right along the edge, doing an edge stitch first. Once we get over here, we'll pivot and come down with a top stitch. And the top stitch is done 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. So let's go ahead and do our edge stitch and top stitch now. All right, now that we have our pocket sewn, yours should look similar to this. Now we can go ahead and grab the right front, and on the inside here we're going to lay side, front, and pocket to the pocket facing, right sides facing, like so. We're going to match up our notches. You should have double notches down here at the bottom. Go ahead and pin. Now you can go ahead and stitch along the curved edge here using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have it sewn, you can see here I finished off my edge with my serger and gave everything a press. Next, you want to go ahead and baste the raw edges up here along the top. Baste the pocket to the skirt along the top and along the side edge like so. Just baste everything together. If yours is not completely matching, that's totally fine. We'll be able to true up our seam allowance once we sew this to the back. Go ahead and do your pocket the same exact way for your left front. The only difference with this one is you won't have this little pocket up here, this little corn pocket. Now let's move on to the next step. All right, now let's start to work on installing our front fly zipper. So the first thing that we want to do is, starting on the right front, you should have transferred a large circle. We are going to reinforce the large circle by stitching through it. So about a 1/2 inch above it and a 1/2 inch below it, just stitch directly through the circle to reinforce it. I also added a little bit of interfacing on the back of mine, just right here where the zipper will be, just to give it a little bit more support and stability. That's just something that I like to do when I install my zippers. So again, right here at that large dot, let's go ahead and reinforce it. And then once you have it stitched, we can go ahead and clip right up to the circle. Being careful not to clip through the stitching. We just want to clip right through it. Now that we have our clip, let's go ahead and get our left front. And with right sides together, we are going to stitch the fronts together below the large dot. So let's go ahead and grab our pins. We're going to stitch our center seam together here below the large dot. So I'm going to pin right here at the large dot. And now let's go ahead and stitch. You can back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Again, we're stitching below the large circle. All right, now that we have the center seam sewn, this is what mine look like. I did go back and serge my edges. I forgot to do that before I did the little clip here, but as you can see, I did go back and just finish off my seam allowance here. But after you have yours sewn, go ahead and press your seam going toward the left. So I have pressed my seam coming toward the left. Next, we're going to press in along the fold line. So you should have transferred a fold line on the right front. We're just gonna go ahead and press that under. Okay, once you have your fold line folded in and pressed, it should look similar to this. And again, this is only on the right side. Now let's move on to the next step and go ahead and grab our zipper. We're going to place our closed zipper, and I'm working on the right side only. We're going to put the teeth right up beside that fold that we just folded. And all I did is just slide it right up under this folded edge here, right along the front. Now I'm going to place some pins in it here. And I'm going to go to the sewing machine, and using my zipper foot, I'm going to baste it in place. You can also use a needle and thread and just hand baste it if you prefer. But let's go ahead and baste it in place now. All right, now that we have the zipper basted in, and again, we basted it to the right side, now we can go ahead and grab the right fly. You should have cut one of fabric and one of interfacing. I've already fused mine with interfacing, and I transferred my dots on the right side here. And so now with right sides together, I am going to fold it along the fold line, and I'm going to stitch the lower edge closed at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have it sewn, we can go ahead and trim and then turn everything right side out. And then we can give it a press. Give it a press, and then I'm also going to finish off this edge with my serger. All right, now that we have our right fly prepped, as you can see, again, I went ahead and serged this edge. Now we can place this right behind the zipper. So on the inside, we're gonna just slide the right fly right up under the zipper like so. And over the edge, this is how mine look right here on the inside. It's right there over the zipper, as you can see. And then we can pin this in place. And so now we can go to the sewing machine. We can baste following along with our previous basting stitch, or if you are ready, you can just go ahead and do your straight stitch following along with the basting stitch. I just want to point out the instructions do say to baste it first. If you're ready to go ahead and stitch, you just follow along with this basting stitch, and let's go ahead and secure the right fly right here to the front behind the zipper. All right, I have my front fly stitched on. You can see my regular stitch here and my basting stitch. I'm going to get my seam ripper and just unpick the basting stitch now. Next, we're going to start working on the left fly facing. You should have cut one of fabric and one of interfacing. I've gone ahead and interfaced mine and transferred my markings. Now I'm just going to go ahead and finish off this curved edge with my serger. All right, now that we have the curved edge here of the left fly finished, let's go ahead and pin it to the left. You want to match up that large circle and your notches and pin in place. So we can stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After we have it stitched, we can trim our seam and do some understitching. Let's go ahead and trim our seam now that we have it sewn. All right, next let's do some understitching. Make sure you have your seam allowance going toward the fly, and we're going to stitch really close to the seam. All right, now that we have the understitching done, we can turn the left fly toward the inside and give that a really good press. Now that you have your left front pressed toward the inside, now you can go ahead and lap it right over the front like so. And then we're going to stitch really close to the edge using a basting stitch just to hold it in place. That way everything is nice and smooth. Then we can finish up with the zipper. Or you can even hand stitch this. I'm going to grab a needle and thread. I think that'll be a lot easier, and I'll have a little bit more control if I just do it with my hand. All right, I have the fly basted, and again, this is just going to help everything remain nice and flat right here while we finish constructing the zipper on the inside of the garment. So now along the inside, we are going to pin the right fly out of the way. We don't want to accidentally stitch this. So I'm just going to pin this over like so. And now we're going to pin the remaining zipper tape to the left fly front. Only the zipper tape in the left fly front. We're not sewing the front. And I'm going to place a few pins here. And now we can go ahead and stitch using our zipper foot. We're going to stitch along the center of the zipper tape and also right along the edge of the zipper tape. Again, only stitching the left fly and the remaining zipper portion here. Now that we have the zipper here sewn to the left fly, now on the outside, and I'm actually going to move my pin from the back to the front just to keep the right fly out of the way. Now we can go ahead and do our stitch following with our stitching line that's on our pattern to make that little curve on the front. You're going to do 2 rows. The first one is going to be right on the stitching line, and then the second one is going to be 1/4 of an inch within the stitching line. So the first one is going to be right along the stitching line, and then the second one is going to be 1/4 of an inch within the stitching line. So you can go ahead and transfer a marking if it will help. Okay, I placed some little guides here. Yours may be a little bit more clearer than mine, but just go ahead and transfer your stitching lines and let's stitch those on now. Again, on the left only, making sure that you catch in the left fly, keep the right fly out of the way. Once you have your stitches sewn, they should look similar to this. You can go ahead and remove your chalk marking or your pen marking if you used one, and we can remove the right fly so that it lays flat. So this is what your inside will look like. Let me clean up some threads here. Along the inside here, we need to hand tack the bottom of our facing and our fly together. And so now I've just tacked my fly to the facing, nice and secure. And as you can see, again, I didn't have a lot of room because that's stitching. So if you can't grip it, just do a quick hand tack right there. I can also go ahead and shorten off my zipper. So I can either use the same thread, or I can just go to the machine and just go across the zipper teeth right here to create a new stop and then trim it away a little bit below. All right, I have my new zipper stop created. I'm just gonna come down a little bit below that. Using my pinking shears, I'm just gonna cut here. And so now this is what my new zipper looks like. Before we remove the basting, you do have the option to add some bar tacks along your stitching lines on the front if that's something you like to do. But if not, you can go ahead and remove your basting. And now we have a really nice and clean front fly zipper. The next thing for us to do is to do some edge stitching and top stitching right down here along the center front seam from the lower edge of the zipper stitching. So again, you can start here at the bottom and do your edge stitch. Once you get up here to the zipper stitching, we can pivot across and then stitch back down at 1/4 inch to do the top stitch. So let's go ahead and do our edge stitch and our top stitch now along the center front. All right, once you have your edge stitch and your top stitching done right here along the center front, we can put this to the side and start to work on the back. To begin working on the back, the first thing that we need to do is go ahead and sew up our back pockets. The back pockets are constructed the same exact way as the front pockets are. So if you already constructed yours when you did the front pockets, great. If not, then go ahead and construct your 2 back pocket pieces the same exact way that we did for the front pocket, and then match them up with the dots that are on the back of the pattern and stitch them on. Again, it's the same exact steps that we did on the front pocket. We're just doing them to the back. You should have transferred 2 dots back here, match up the top of your pocket with those 2 dots, and then go ahead and do your edge stitch and your top stitch to secure them in place. Next, we want to go ahead and grab our yoke. And for our yoke, pattern piece number 21, you should have cut out 2. And so with the right sides facing, we're going to match up the double notches here and pin in place. It will be like a little bit of a little triangle here on this end. That's normal. Just continue pinning, and once you have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then we can finish off our seams and press the seam going up toward the yoke. Now that we have it sewn, you can see I finished off my seam. I pressed it going up toward the yoke. We can go ahead and do a 1/4 inch top stitch on the yoke from this seam. So a 1/4 inch from this seam, let's go ahead and do top stitching right along the yoke. Now that we have the top stitching done, let's go ahead and grab the other back and place them right sides facing. We're going to match up our notches, match up our seam here as well. Pin that in place. Let's go ahead and stitch the center back seam together using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And then you can go ahead and finish off your seam. Press your seam going to the right, and then do a top stitch along the right back. Let's go ahead and stitch it first. Now that we have the center top stitch, let's go ahead and move on to the next step by taking our front, laying it over the back, right sides facing, and we can sew our side seams. So let's go ahead and match up our notches and pin in place. Once you have your side seams pinned, let's go ahead and stitch in a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Once you have your side seams sewn, you can go ahead and give them a press. Finish off your edges as well, and then give it a press, and then we can put the skirt to the side for just a moment. Next, you want to go ahead and grab your carriers. You should have cut out 1. The first thing that you want to do is go ahead and fold it in half lengthwise like so, and then give that a press. All right, once you have it pressed, then you want to go ahead and open it out like so. And you want to fold in the raw edges on both sides to the crease. And then you can give that a press. All right, once you have that pressed, then you want to fold it along that original crease and give it one final press. After you have the final press, this is what the carrier should look like. And now we're just going to go to the sewing machine, and you want to stitch along both edges of the long edge. Stitch close to the edge, all the way down on both of the long edges to create your carrier. This is what that will look like when you are all done. It would be all stitched again on both of the long edges. Go ahead and do an edge stitch on your carrier. Once you have your carrier sewn, now we can go ahead and cut it into 5 pieces that measure 3 3/4. Once you have cut your carriers, now we can go ahead and pin them on to the skirt at our small dot markings. So you should have transferred some dots. Here's one of my dots here. I'm going to match up the raw edges and pin that in place. After you have them pinned, let's go ahead and baste them in place. Now that we have the carriers basted on, you can clip away your loose threads if you like, and we can put this to the side and start to work on the waistband. For the waistband, you should have cut 4 out of pattern piece number 23, which is the front waistband, and you should have cut out 2 of the back waistband, pattern piece number 24, and interfaced 1. So just go ahead and stitch your front waistbands onto the back right at the ends, matching up your notches. And now let's go ahead and grab the skirt. With right sides facing, I'm going to go ahead and pin the waistband on. And so what I'm going to do is kind of flip it like so. You should have transferred a notch on your front waistband that should match up to the front. You will have some that extend, that is normal, but just find that single notch and match that up and pin that in place. And just continue matching up your notches, your side seams, all the way along the waistband. I do want to point out that the instructions do say to baste this in place, because in a later step we will be doing a stitch in the ditch here, and that will secure the seam. But I'm going to just do a regular stitch now just to go ahead and stitch it. But if you want to baste it, I just want you to know that the instructions do say to baste it together at this step. Let's go ahead and stitch now. All right, once you have your waistband sewn on, we can go ahead and press the waistband seam, press it up or at the waistband. I do want to point out that whenever I attach a waistband like this, I always do the zipper test. So I always zip up my zipper and I look just to make sure that everything is going to meet up here at the end. Next, we're going to go ahead and fold up the remaining end of our belt loop, and you should have transferred some dots on your waistband. Just match those up and pin in place, raw edges even. All right, now let's go ahead and baste these in place. Now that we have the tops of our belt loops basted on, let's go ahead and grab the bodice. And with right sides facing, we're going to go ahead and pin the lower edge of the bodice to the top of the waistband. So we do want to make sure that we match up our notches. So let's just start pinning at our side seams, match those up, and then match up our notches. The front opening here of your bodice, it should match up with the opening of your skirt, not the waistband here. And just continue pinning right sides facing, matching up all your notches and your side seams. All right, now that we have it pinned, let's go ahead and baste this in place. Now that we have it basted on, let's go ahead and grab our waistband facing. So these are the other waistband pieces. Again, we should have cut out 4 of the front facing and interfaced 2, and 2 of the back facing and interfaced 1. So this is the waistband facing, and I have stitched this the same exact way that I stitched the other waistband. Right here at the sides, I matched up the notches and stitched in place. On the lower edge here, you can see I pressed up a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and now I'm going to trim that down to 1/4 inch. Now that we have this trim, let's go ahead and pin this to the upper edge of the waistband. And so now this is the waistband facing, so we are going to be pinning this over the bodice like so, and we want to place the waistband right over it, sandwiching in that bodice seam like so. This is what that will look like. Now let's go ahead and pin. All right, once you have it pinned, now we can go ahead and stitch. We're going to stitch this front edge closed, pivot, and stitch all the way across. We're going to be stitching in a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And then again, you want to stitch this opening edge closed here as well at the waistband. So let's go ahead and stitch now. Again, we're going to be stitching using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. All right, let's go ahead and trim our seam, and then we can turn our waistband toward the inside and give everything a good press. All right, go ahead and turn it right side out. It should look like this right at that opening. And so now again, we can just press the inside waistband, press it down so that this folded edge comes right past that seam, the same way that we've been doing with the sleeves, that we did with the collar. We're just going to press the inside, the waistband facing down, and have this pressed edge coming right past the seam. Let's go ahead and do that, and then we can put our pins in it on the outside and do a stitch in the ditch. All right, once you have it all pinned, and again, I pinned on the outside, making sure I catched in the pressed edge of the waistband facing along the inside. And so now we can go ahead and do a stitch in the ditch all the way around the waistband. Once I get around the belt loops, I'm going to push them up and out of the way and just continue doing a stitch in the ditch all the way along the waistband. Let's do that now. Now that we have done our stitch in the ditch, this is what mine's look like here along the inside. All right, next we need to do some top stitching along the waistband. So we're going to do a 1/4 inch top stitch along the front edges here, the front opening edges, as well as the lower edge and the top edge, this opening edge as well on our waistband, the same exact way that we did for the cuff. The only difference with this one is going to be a little bit tricky. Every time you come up to a belt loop, you need to get as close as you can, back stitch, and then you can pull the thread through to the inside and tie a knot. Or if you want, you can back stitch here and cut your thread, move the belt loop to the other side, start back where you left off at, and continue. You want everything to be hidden where you start and stop at behind the belt loops. Again, make sure that you start and stop right here behind the belt loops so that everything is kind of hidden and it's nice and clean along your waistband. Let's go ahead and do our top stitch now. All right, now that you have your top stitching done, this is what mine look like here. You can see where I stopped and started behind my belt loops. So this is what the right side looks like. On the inside, you can see the start and stop. So you can just trim these down. You can tie knots in them if you need to secure them, but you can just clean them up. All right, once you have cleaned up your waistband, now let's go ahead and sew the hem on our dress. The hem allowance is 5/8 inch. You can press up 5/8 inch and give that a really good press. Open it out and fold in the raw edges to the crease, and then fold it back over Give that a press and stitch close to the pressed edge. It's the same thing that we did for this little coin pocket at an earlier step. We're just repeating that narrow hem. So let's go ahead and hem the dress now. All right, now that we have our hem sewn, this is what mine looks like along the outside, and this is what it looks like along the inside. So go ahead and press up your hem and stitch it in place. And the last thing for us to do is to go ahead and apply our snaps. We will need 8 snaps, and we will apply those to the front as well as to the sleeve. So these are the snaps right here that I'm going to use. I got these from my local Walmart. They're 5/8 of an inch, heavy duty snaps. And I'm going to be using this Dritz tool right here. This is for heavy duty snaps, 5/8 of an inch. It comes with an instructional guide as well as the other pieces needed to attach each part of the snap. All right, once you have your snaps attached, you can give everything one final press, and you have just finished Know Me ME2133. Well, that is all for the sew along, and I really hope that you all enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down for me below. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Go ahead and grab my pattern from simplicity.com. Again, the pattern number is Know Me 2133, and I will see you all in the next video. Blessings, everyone. Bye.